Welcome to Research Review video for a publication that came out in November of last year entitled Individuals Under Voluntary Treatment for Sexual Interest in Minors, What Risks Do They Pose? I chose this as a topic or a study to do a research review on because it does answer a question that we get all the time. There's this dark specter of recidivism studies that we know about, wherein most recidivism studies are looking at known recidivism, meaning convicted or charged new crimes related to sexual offending. And everybody's always like, well, there's obviously more things that are going on that aren't detected, so how real are these recidivism rates? And this study comes out of Germany, and they have different mandatory reporting laws or requirements. So this is a study actually that could look at recidivism rates based on just engaging in the behavior and not necessarily reoffending in a legal sense. So this study was published in Germany, and the participants and the researchers are through the Do Not Offend program there, which comes out of the Project Dunkelfeld, if anyone is familiar with that. In Germany, they do not have the same mandatory reporting rules and regulations that we have in the United States. They are not required to report if a client comes into them and says that they have viewed CSAM or they have historically engaged in child sexual abuse behavior. So they have a program through this Do Not Offend where people or individuals who are attracted to minors or who feel like they might be at risk for engaging in child sexual abuse of some kind can call, and they can get treatment to try to help either not offend in the first time, or maybe if there is a historical offense that wasn't necessarily caught by law enforcement, they can go in and get help to try not to repeat that. This particular study that we're talking about today was particularly looking at these questions. So what is the risk for child sexual abuse and child sexual abuse material viewing posed by individuals who present themselves voluntarily for treatment and without treatment requirements through this Do Not Offend program? And so this means they're not forensic people. There's no, German equivalent of probation or parole telling them that as part of their requirements, they have to engage in treatment for sexual offending. They had three main objectives. The first was to compare the rates of child sexual abuse and child sexual abuse material use in the history of their study participants versus what is known based on published data for the German samples. The second goal was to compare the recidivism rates of child sexual abuse and CSAM use in this particular sample, the ones who voluntarily engaged in treatment, and compare that to those reported in two major recidivism studies, the Helmut et al. For child sexual abuse and the CETO study for CSAM. And the third was to test for the predictive validity of the static 99, the static C, and the C-port. In order to be a participant in the study, a person had to be not currently involved with a legal issue in the system. They could not be adequately counseled via telephone, so anyone whose issues could be done through telehealth, they were not included. They couldn't be included if there wasn't enough diagnostic or insufficient data, or obviously if they didn't consent, they were not participants in this study. And the participants in the study were treated in the Do Not Offend program in two facilities in Germany, one in Hamburg and one in Bamberg. So what measures did they use? They used something that they called the static C, which is something designed based on the static 99. It's a 12-item measure, not something that we use very often, and I believe that they had kind of come up with as something to maybe use with CSAM offenders. They also used the static 99, which is very commonly used pretty much everywhere to look at recidivism risk for contact offending. The C-port, which is a tool that is sometimes used but is, in the midst of reliability and validity studies, and that is specifically for child pornography offending or CSAM offending. They also looked at the CASIC, which is another assessment that uses history, the client's history, to assess whether or not they perhaps fit the pedohemophilic sexual interest category. And then they also looked at, does the individual fit the diagnostic criteria for pedophilic disorder based on the ICD-10? What were the results of the study? So we're going to break it down into a number of categories. First, when they look at historical child sexual abuse or CSAM use, so this is what happened in these individuals' lives before they voluntarily came in for treatment. The observed frequency for the participants of child sexual abuse that they had perpetrated was 35%. So 35% of the individuals had historically engaged in childhood sexual abuse. And when they compared that, there's a prevalence study for the German population that said about 1.5% of people in that prevalence study had acknowledged committing a sexual assault of a child. So that's a huge difference, clearly. They also did the same thing for CSAM. And so the individuals in this study, historically, 80% of them had viewed CSAM materials. Again, when we compare it to this German study of prevalence, that study said about 2.4% of their participants acknowledged looking at CSAM. So that's a just massive difference between what was reported in this population versus the prevalence study. Now, things to note, right? So the population of this study are people who are volunteering, they're going in themselves for treatment for their attraction to minors, versus a prevalence study is just going to be the general population of people. So what kind of reoffending behavior happened? First of all, we have to talk about time at risk. And in this study, it's 2.5 years. So these people were on average in this program for about 2.5 years or followed for about 2.5 years. So how much child sexual abuse happened during that time at risk? So for individuals who had a history of child sexual abusive behaviors in the past, their recidivism rate was 14% in the study. The expected frequency based on the meta-analysis of Helmut et al. Was 15%. So this was not significantly different. So what they were seeing in the study of these folks voluntarily going into treatment was the same as what the meta-analyses of recidivism for child sexual abuse tends to be. In terms of CSAM, things were a little different. So again, they only looked at the participants who had acknowledged using CSAM in the past. The observed recidivism rate for those folks was 39%. And in the Cito et al. Study that they were using as a comparison was 3.4%. So that's, again, a huge difference, and this was a statistically significant difference. So in this study where there was not mandatory reporting rules and people could come in and say, yes, I viewed CSAM, they're looking at reoffending behavior at 39% versus what was published by Cito et al. Of 3.4%. This slide looks at the results based on what the risk is for child sexual abuse in the future again. So what was their risk of reoffending or offending with child sexual abuse? When everybody in the study was used, when we're looking at that risk, there was no significant association, and that was done based on correlation coefficients or AUC measures between child sexual abuse recidivism and any of those measures that they use, the static 99, the static C, the C-port with clinical diagnosis, and the C-port with the CASIC. So nothing significantly predicted subsequent child sexual abuse when you look at the entire population. When you pull out those folks who already had a history of child sexual abuse, there was no significant correlation between that recidivism with the static 99 and the static C. Which is interesting. You pull out those with just a history of CSAM, no significant correlation between future child sexual abuse with the C-port plus the clinical diagnosis or the C-port with the CASIC, and that was correlations. They did find, when they looked at the ROC analysis, that there was a significant association between the C-port with the CASIC measure, but not the C-port with the clinical diagnosis. And so why is this important? Again, one question that folks always have when we're looking at CSAM offending is, what is their risk of escalating and moving perhaps from an internet-only based offending behavior pattern to also offending in a contact manner with a child? And so in this particular population, the C-port, when you combine that with that CASIC measure, was significantly associated with future child sexual abuse. When we look at what is the risk for future CSAM use, again, they did it with all of the participants, and when everybody in the study was used, there was no significant association between future CSAM use and the static C or the static 99. That's not surprising, as those are not normed on that population. There were significant associations between future CSAM use and the C-port with clinical diagnosis and the C-port with the CASIC. And again, that's the whole population. When you break that down further and you look at just the individuals who have a history of CSAM use, there was not a significant association between future CSAM use and that static C measure that they used, as well as the C-port plus clinical diagnosis. What did work, what was significantly associated between future CSAM use or recidivism, was the C-port with that CASIC measure as well. So looking at the clinical diagnosis in the C-port wasn't predictive, but it was when they used the CASIC. So what are our takeaways? What do we get from this data? Pretty much all of the risk assessment measures that were used, but for the C-port, had very limited predictive validity in this particular population of folks who volunteered for treatment. This is what they call that non-forensic sample. The interesting piece here is that the C-port, meeting the criteria for the C-port and a clinical diagnosis for pedophilic disorder, did not have predictive validity for future use. So 45% of this sample met the CASIC cutoff for pedophilic sexual interest. Well, when you went by the ICD-10, 88% did. So there's a lot more folks perhaps that met the diagnostic criteria than actually, upon further evaluation, maybe actually have that pedophilic sexual interest. And so the authors say that this suggests that the diagnosis of the pedohemophilic disorder might not be a good predictor of recidivism by itself, but that CASIC use in addition to the C-port is helpful, and there might be something about the CASIC that's identifying this subgroup of individuals with a sexual interest in minors who are more prone to reoffend than those who are not. Another point in this discussion, which I think is pretty important, and answers for this study population at least that question of, what about recidivism and what about all this recidivism that we don't know about? This study found that recidivism for the individuals here was 11 times higher than that has been observed in meta-analysis based on folks who have been legally charged and sentenced for CSAM offenses. So we know that it's higher because we know that most recidivism studies are only measuring known recidivism, which usually means charged or convicted. And here's a study where folks can acknowledge CSAM use without fear of being reported. And in this particular study, it turns out that prevalence was 11 times higher. So with any research study, we also have to look at, what are the limitations? Some of them suggested by the authors are that this was still self-report data. While they're doing this work in a country that doesn't have these mandatory reporting laws, they're still relying on the clients to acknowledge that they have sexually abused someone or they have viewed CSAM materials. Another possible limitation was that their CSAM definition did not include anime or drawn pornography, and we're seeing a lot more of that in cases that at least we work with here in Pennsylvania. Another possible limitation is that all of the instruments used only included static risk factors, right? Those are the risk factors that can't change. And there was no measure used that assessed dynamic risk factor. And another possible limitation is that this time at risk period, the time at which they were following them or were looking at these reoffending behavior rates, was 2.5 years. And in terms of recidivism studies, that's perhaps not a fabulous length of follow-up time. It's not horrible, but it's not perhaps optimal. So, it's limited to that 2.5 year period. So for me, what are some of the big takeaways? The first is that both for child sexual abuse and interactions with child sexual abuse materials, the rates are so much higher in these study participants than what was reported in the comparison sample, and this was the German sample. The other big piece is that this CSAM recidivism observed here was 11% higher than what has been reported in the scientific literature. So it gives us a number, right? At least for this one study to kind of look at and say, here's what's reported based on convictions and charges, and hey, here's another study that has a different number based on when they're allowed to self-report without fear of being reported and charged and convicted and all of those things. And of course, here is the reference for the article that we have just discussed. It was published in November of 2023 in the journal Frontiers in Psychiatry. So nothing in this video is my own work. It is very simply a summary of the published scientific study that was published in the Frontiers in Psychiatry. And if you want to read it for yourself, there it is.